Okay, this recording is material covering chapter 24, which is the urinary system anatomy. So I'm going to be going over major points and concepts covered in the lab quiz 9 review for the urinary system. Let me see if I can magnify this up a little bit so you can see it a little bit better, more clearly. So make sure you review your anatomy, your urinary anatomy from lab exercise 24, which is from your Green's lab manual, which is figure 24.2, 24.3, 24.5, 24.6, 24.8, 9, 10, 11, A, B, and C, and figure 24.12. This comes from that human anatomy and physiology, the hands-on approach, as you can see. To be able to identify the major features of the kidneys, as you can see from this mid-sagittal view, you can see the major calyx down here. Remember, a major calyx is just a larger calyx than a minor calyx. A minor calyx is what the renal papilla, which is a pyramid, empties the urine into first, after it comes from the pyramid, the nephrons in the pyramid. So the minor calyx drains into a major calyx, which is just below the minor calyxes. Usually a major calyx will drain 2 or 3 minor calyxes, and each minor calyx will drain one pyramid. So each minor calyx will drain one pyramid, one renal pyramid. And you'll have just one minor calyx, and then you'll have per renal papilla, and then you'll have 2 or 3 minor calyxes for every major calyxes. So these little structures right here are major calyxes, right where my finger is. Okay, all of these are major calyxes. Here's another one. Okay, and then the renal pelvis is that funnel-shaped region, kind of triangular-shaped region that all the major calyxes empty the urine into before it goes into the ureter. Of course, the pyramids are the area of the kidney that's in the middle section where the renal medulla is located, and then the cortex is on the outer region just below the renal capsule. Remember, the renal cortex is where you'll see most of your glomeruli, your renal corpuscles, and your tubules. And you'll see your nephron loops and your collecting ducts. Those will be located mainly in the pyramids. Okay, these little triangular structures. And remember, your renal arteries, what supplies blood to the kidneys, which is, like we said, is 25% of your cardiac output. And remember, the renal artery, you need to be able to trace the blood flow into the kidneys. Remember, the renal artery becomes a segmental artery as it goes into the renal pelvis. And when it goes in between the pyramids, it becomes a interlobar artery, and then it makes a little turn between the cortex and the medulla, and that's what we call the arcuate artery. And then it goes up into an interlobular artery, which goes up into the outer renal cortex. And then from the interlobular artery, remember, the blood vessels branch into the afferent arteriole, which goes into the renal corpuscle, the glomerulus. And then remember, the efferent arteriole then drains into the peritubular capillaries for cortical nephrons, and the efferent arteriole drains into the vasa recta for your medullary nephrons. And the peritubular capillaries then follow the same course that the arteries followed, but in reverse order. So the peritubular capillaries empty into the interlobular vein, then empties into the arcuate vein, and it basically runs parallel to the arcuate artery. And then the arcuate vein then travels into the interlobar vein, which runs parallel to the interlobar artery, which with blood flowing in the opposite direction. And the interlobar vein then empties directly into the renal vein. The renal papilla, that's just the tip of the renal pyramids. So here's the blood supply. Be able to trace the blood supply, the blood flow through the kidneys, starting with the renal artery and ending with the renal vein, as you can see here. It starts with the renal artery, then into the segmental artery, and it goes into the interlobar artery. It makes a little turn, and becomes the arcuate artery. Arcuate artery then goes up to the cortex, so that's called the interlobular artery. Remember, the interlobular artery is also referred to as the cortical radiate artery. The interlobular artery is also referred to as the cortical radiate artery. The reason for that naming is because it radiates up into the cortex, so that's why it's called the cortical radiate artery. So here's the cortical radiate artery, which is the same thing as the interlobular artery. Okay. And then the interlobular artery, then that's where the afferent arteriole comes off. Afferent arteriole then becomes a glomerulus, and then what's not filtered across the glomerular filtration membrane into the nephron will go out the efferent arteriole, as you can see here, which I think is 7 is glomerulus, so 8 is efferent arteriole. The efferent arteriole then leads to the peritubular capillaries, which is number 9. It's colored purple because it's in the state of partially oxygenated, partially deoxygenated blood, where artery, of course, is fully oxygenated, and your veins are fully deoxygenated. So the peritubular capillaries then empty into the interlobular vein. Interlobular vein then empties into the arcuate vein. Arcuate vein then follows reverse order. Arcuate vein then goes into the interlobar vein, which then jumps into the renal vein. So know your blood vessel anatomy. Be able to trace the blood flow through the kidney, starting with the renal artery and ending with the renal vein. First, make sure you know the difference between a male and female urinary anatomy. Remember, the urethra in the female is much shorter. It's only 4 centimeters. Of course, the ureters are what carry the urine from the kidneys to the bladder, which is the structure that you see right here in the female. And then in the male, it's over here. In the male, you have a prostatic urethra, which is the urethra as it first exits the urinary bladder in the male. The prostatic urethra then goes through the prostate gland, and then when it goes out of the prostate gland, there's a little area where it's only surrounded by a membrane. Okay, and that's called the membranous urethra. Okay, and then the membranous urethra will then enter the penis, where it's going to be surrounded by corpus spongiosum, erectile tissue. So we refer to this part of the male urethra as the spongy urethra. In male, the entire length of the male urethra is roughly 20 centimeters, okay? Whereas in the female, of course, it's only 4 centimeters. Okay? Vaginal canal is behind it, and the rectal canal is behind the vaginal canal. Okay, this is a renal corpuscle. A renal corpuscle is basically a glomerular capsule plus the glomerulus inside the glomerular capsule. Okay, and then the juxtaglomerular apparatus is primarily the afferent and efferent arteriole with the JG cells and that structure that helps regulate blood pressure and your GFR. So make sure you can identify the afferent and efferent arteriole. Remember, the afferent arteriole has a wider diameter than the efferent arteriole. And it's the afferent arteriole that you remember that takes the blood into the glomerulus, whereas the efferent arteriole drains the blood from the glomerulus. Remember, the efferent arteriole and afferent arteriole are both small arteries. Okay, so that's why the blood pressure is so much higher in your glomerular filtration membrane than when compared to a typical organ. The glomerular hydrostatic pressure is roughly 50 to 55 millimeters of mercury, and a typical organ, an arterial capillary, is only about 25 to 30 millimeters of mercury, almost twice that of a capillary in other parts of the body. Now, the proximal tubule is the first part of the nephron past the glomerular capsule. The capsular space is the space between the visceral layer and the parietal layer of the capsule. To be able to identify those different features of the renal corpuscle. Note that this is a histology micrograph of the bladder, urinary bladder, and this is transitional epithelium in the brackets, and below the transitional epithelium, which is also the mucosa. A is the mucosa, which is transitional epithelium. It's transitional epithelium. And the transitional epithelium has a unique ability to expand and contract, change shape, depending on the distension or contraction of the urinary bladder. Okay, that's why you have transitional epithelium and the urinary bladder and the ureters and even partly in the urethra. That's because the bladder is an organ that constantly resumes different shapes because of the filling, the distension of the bladder, and the contraction of the bladder. And so when the urinary bladder is distended, like when you're filled up with urine, up to about 800 mils, those transitional epithelium cells at the surface will be very flat, almost squamous shaped. Whereas when you empty your bladder after voiding, then the transitional epithelium at the top, the luminal surface or the apical surface, will be very cuboidal shaped. Okay, that's reason it's in transition. That's reason it's called transitional epithelium. And then the basement membrane is just underneath the transitional epithelium, the mucosa. And then below that is your macropropria, which is your submucosa. And then below the submucosa, of course, would be your smooth muscle, the detrusor muscle, which is down at the bottom. Here's another view of the kidney, sagittal view. Make sure you know all these features that you see here in the key: the renal cortex, renal medulla, capsule, pelvis, artery, vein, renal artery, renal vein, and ureter. And make sure you know each of these areas. This is the renal capsule, and here's the renal cortex up here. Remember, you can't differentiate the renal cortex and the adrenal medulla, so we just call this the adrenal gland. 3 would be the adrenal gland. Okay, and then this is a nephron. Okay, the renal corpus with the glomerulus. And here's the proximal convoluted tubule. Remember, all this is in the cortex, the outer region of the kidney. This is called a proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted means it twists and turns. It's convoluted. Okay. Arcuate artery, arcuate vein, and then from the proximal tubule, then it descends into the medulla. That's called the descending limb of the nephron loop. Then it makes a 180-degree turn and then becomes the ascending limb of the nephron loop. You have a thin segment and a thick segment. And then the ascending, thick segment of the ascending nephron loop then becomes a distal tubule. The distal, sometimes called also the distal convoluted tubule. And then it empties into the collecting tract. So here's the distal tubule. Top here. Okay. Be able to differentiate also the descending limb from the ascending limb of the nephron loop. And here's another sagittal view of the kidneys. Be able to identify each of the structures labeled, like the pyramids, the cortex, the minor calyx, the ureter, renal pelvis, the renal papilla, that tip of the pyramid, the major calyx, and then the minor calyx up here. Arcuate vessels, which are the artery and the vein, and interlobar vessels, which are the interlobar artery and vein. These little red vessels out here would be the interlobular artery or arcuate, or the interlobular artery is also called the cortical-radial artery. And this is how the afferent arterial comes on. And here's a blow-up and a cortical nephron on the left. Okay, so on the right here, you have a medullary nephron or juxtamedullary nephron. Juxtamedullary. juxtamedullary juxtamedullary. So you can see the base recta, the collecting duct, and then the cortical nephron will be on the left. This is actually labeled juxtamedullary down here at the bottom, and this would be a cortical nephron. I didn't realize they'd already labeled this. So this is a juxtamedullary nephron. Okay, another point I want to mention is this will be the 9th point that I'll mention. The functional units of the kidneys are the nephrons. The nephron consists of 2 components. Okay. And they are the renal corpuscle, which consists of the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus, and B, the tubules. The proximal tubule, that's where you have your reabsorption occurring and your greatest change in volume. Remember, proximal tubule's main concern is reabsorption, tubular reabsorption. And then the second part is the nephron loop. It's called the loop of Henle, both the descending and ascending limbs. And then the third part is the distal tubule. Distal tubule is where you have your most of your select tubular reabsorption. That's facultative or hormonally dependent. Like most of your sodium and water is going to be reabsorbed at the time. Those 2 components are in the distal tubule. So depending on your body needs, will determine whether the rest of the sodium and water are reabsorbed in the distal tubule and then finally the collecting duct. So if aldosterone and ADH are present, then the sodium and water will be reabsorbed in the distal tubule and collecting duct as well. And if ADH and aldosterone are not present, then the water and the sodium will stay in the distal tubule. That's what we mean by facultative or hormonal dependent. So be able to know that the functional units of the kidneys are the nephrons. This is where your blood is filtered to produce tubular fluid, which then becomes the urine. And you have 2 components of a nephron: a renal corpuscle, which is where your blood is filtered across the glomerular filtration membrane. And the second is the renal tubules, which consists of the proximal tubule, the nephron loop, which consists of a descending and an ascending limb, and then a distal tubule. And finally, the collecting duct is what the nephrons empty into to take the tubular fluid into eventually the papillary collecting duct, where it's basically called urine. So I'll stop there, and that will be your review for lab quiz